Well, that's two of us. Hold on.
You made it in. Oops.
Sorry.
No, don't worry.
I mean, it's.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, okay, you made it.
I know, but I'm not even, wasn't, it doesn't make any sense. I'm letting, okay, let me get,
Welcome back, everybody. Moadim L'Simcha, as Debbie started us off. Let's just start off. I think there are few enough of us that we can do it out loud. A highlight of your Pesach so far? Something that's been sweet or fun or...
I'll just say that it was really my nephew who lives in Mount Pleasant here and has just started a new job and started grad school at Georgetown. And called me to make sure I was making Pesach this year so that he could come, which was so fun. So he brought a friend, and we just had 4 people, but I'm so glad to be able to host. So that's my story.
We tried to get our 15-month-old granddaughter to do the 4 questions, but
How'd that go?
it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
It was fabulous having her. That was fun.
That's beautiful, Bev. Thank you. All right, one more coming. One more.
Both my sons came in town to join us, so that was lovely. And one of my son's girlfriend also joined us, so it felt very family. And we had actually another couple as well. We had 8 people all told, which felt huge for having not done it for so many years.
That's great.
Bob and Peggy folks are just sharing something sweet from their Pesach so far. Anyone else want to chime in?
We went to Manhattan last weekend for a pre-Seder, my wife's family. There were 5 of us in our generation. There were 18 in our daughter's generation.
Wow.
And another 18 in the grandchildren and great-grandchildren generation. People from all across the country, many of the young cousins that never met each other.
Wow.
So it was really something. Our family is now about 1/4 Black and about 60% not Jewish.
Yeah.
And like the United Nations, and it was a lot of fun.
Nice.
Kids all got along.
Yeah, like the United Nations and like the Jewish people.
Indeed.
Sometimes.
Anyone else want to share? So our Seder was a Reconstructionist shul success story.
Oh.
For many years, we had a Hebrew school carpool that was 4 families from our neighborhood. Our shul was in another neighborhood. And then along the way, a 5th family joined. But one of the 4 families moved to Boston several years ago. And the other 3 families, it's high school spring break here was last week. So we were all on the identical New England college looking trip. So we all invited ourselves to the Boston family's house for Seder. And we had such a fabulous time as a reunion of the Hebrew school carpool. So we took a picture and sent it to Rabbi Sean Zevit.
That's wonderful. Was the a college tour equally successful or productive at least?
You know, different for every kid. I like looking at colleges because I don't have to, I already went. So welcome back, everybody. We are going to pick up today. And so the way I took notes, I know I took notes last time, but I don't know where I put them. I don't think we spent a lot of time with the beginning of Genesis last time, did we?
No, we started, but we did not spend much time.
One of the things I'm finding, I'm 57 and I'm, thank God, still feel cognitively sharp in the moment, but the number of things I can't remember takes me by surprise every day. So what we're going to do today is look at Rashi and Ibn Ezra's comments on the first 3 words of the Torah. And I'm expecting that some of you will know kind of what the complications of these 3 words are, and even where medieval Jewish commentators end up. That's okay. In fact, that's good. Because what I want us to be thinking about is not only where Rashi and Ibn Ezra end up, but how they get there, and what for them are the strategies they use to figure out what this bumpy bit of Torah means. So I want to start off by reminding you what they say in their introductions to their Torah commentaries about what they're doing. So Rashi said, "My own purpose is to explain the straightforward sense of the text, the pshat, using only those details from traditional lore that are most fit to resolve difficulties in the flow of the story." And we talked about this a fair bit, that he's going to use the rabbinic midrash when he thinks it comes in to, in quotes, explain, resolve difficulties in the flow of the story. We then talked about Ibn Ezra, who has some rather harsh things to say about the way other people do commentary, including, although not named by name, Rashi. And in his, when he's talking about a midrashic approach, he has some anywhere between grudging and snarky respect for midrash as a genre on its own. So he says, in talking about midrash, some are profound, some are entertaining, some are rational, some can even be used to educate children. But ultimately, he's going to say they are not good tools for determining the pshat. He describes midrash as garments that cover the real body. So he says that when you're doing midrash, you're doing something else. You're doing fashion, you're not doing anatomy. And he describes his own method as seeking the correct meaning of each and every word. He's speaking in the first person, with all my might. Then I will interpret each verse as best as I am able. And if you'll remember, he's very specific that halakha, that law, that rabbinic opinion has a very different status. That he says if we find 2 possible meanings when we're reading a legal text, we follow the one handed down by our righteous sages. So his kind of, no rabbinic authority thing really applies to narrative, and the rabbis have a very different status for him in halakha. So that's just a reminder of where they were. I'm going to put in the chat the source sheet again.
Great.
Don't have access. People off camera, just give a little Zoom thumbs up if you have access to the source sheet. Okay. If the off-camera folks are having trouble, let me know. If not, I'll assume you're okay. Okay. Page 9. So can somebody please read in Hebrew the Genesis 1:1, just the very first verse of the Torah?
Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim v'et haaretz.
Great. Wait, oh, I actually have a wrong copy. Hold on. Got it. Okay. So I gave you here, well, actually, before we go there. So if somebody knows the difficulty with these first couple of words, let's crowdsource what we know so far. What is problematic from a language perspective about the very beginning of Torah? Anybody know? If not, we will learn it together. So these are on the source sheet, two different translations. King James Version says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the New Revised Standard, which is also what the JPS has, says, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was tohu vavohu. So what's the difference between those two translations?
Well, one seems
Yeah,
to be
Luther.
a finished task and the other is perhaps continuing to create.
Good. So one is a finished task. In the beginning, here's what God did. The other continuous. Good. Luther, what else?
Pretty much the same thing. It's one assumes that this is the start. There's nothing before. The other does not make that assumption.
Good. And in fact, the other says very explicitly, the rest of the sentence in JPS is, when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void with darkness over the surface of the deep and wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, let there be light. So describes what was there at the beginning before God does God's let there be light thing. So the reason why there is ambiguity in the Hebrew has to do with what's really a grammatical problem in this verse. Does anybody know what a construct is in Hebrew or a genitive in any other language? Okay, so when in English, when we want to express a connection between two words, we often use the word of, right? The house of my friend, or we'll use an apostrophe possessive, Karen's dog, right? So we make those connections by using a preposition or a possessive, but the forms of the nouns in English don't change. If you took Latin, I think if you took Greek, I think German is this way. There are languages that have different forms of nouns depending on what role they're playing in the sentence. So dog is going to be different if the dog is the subject or the object. You with me so far? Hebrew is one of those languages. In Hebrew, the form of the noun changes if it is in any wide degree of relationships with another noun where we would normally say of. And this word reshit, 9 times out of 10 is in that form, that it's the beginning of something. You with me so far? However, that form of a noun is always supposed to be followed by another noun. It's supposed to be followed by a regular noun. It's supposed to be followed by different forms of verbs that function as nouns, but it really is always supposed to be followed by a noun. Here, it's followed by the word bara, which is a simple past tense verb. So if there were a, language arts teacher back in the, whenever you want to say this text was written, 7th, 6th century BCE, she would have corrected this sentence because the grammar is bad. Okay? So this is why you have the ambiguity. The oh, and there is one other case where this word reshit functions as a plain noun. So you have an the grammatical messiness of the verse leads to two possible, but slightly, hammering a square peg into a round hole solutions. One is that you understand it as an absolute noun. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And there you're kind of not reading it as a construct form, you're reading it as an absolute form, right? So there you're kind of being a little wiggly with the reshit. Or you say in the beginning of God's creating, which you're reading the reshit form right, but you're ignoring that it's not being followed by the right thing. So both of these are kind of 70% solutions to what is a very grammatically problematic verse. You with me so far? Okay. Yeah, Bob.
I don't know Hebrew grammar, but in English, there's sometimes implied words. Like if there's a conversation and you say he's going, it might be understood that he's going home. Does Hebrew have a possibility of implied words that you get from the context?
Beautiful. Absolutely. And one of the things we're going to see how, Bob, I'm so glad you asked that question, because one of the things we're going to be looking at in Ibn Ezra is what are his assumptions about Hebrew based on the Bible? And yes, because there are grammatically funky things happen in Torah all the time. And often they get solved exactly as you're saying, kind of contextually. So why does this one become an object of reflection or kind of debate? What's at stake in whether you say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, or when God began creating the heavens and the earth was tohu vavohu, et cetera, et cetera. Why would anybody, what difference does a difference make? Mim.
Well, the whole concept of creation from nothing or not creation from something or creation from nothing hinges on how you read those first two words. And because it was always read as in the beginning God created, there was a kind of institutional stake in its meaning from nothing.
Wait, so say which one you think is the traditional one?
The traditional one is there's something from nothing, which is in the beginning. That's my understanding anyway. I don't know if that's correct.
Okay, good. We're going to unpack it. So one says God created from nothing, and the other said that God created from primordial stuff. Debbie.
So this is a little tangential. I'd actually raised my hand before you finished your question. So, but I guess in my mind, since the whole idea of like temporality in God is sort of fuzzy anyway, I think it makes sense that we would have fuzzy grammar, because when you talk about is and God and created in time and space, and we don't know. So is there supposed to be a definite answer? That I don't even know. Because we're talking about one world, right? We're not talking about all worlds. And I mean, this was probably beyond the scope of the discussion, but it just, I don't know, it just, to me, just evokes the whole sense of God's presence being beyond our comprehension. And that was what I was fixated on.
So you are channeling the Rambam, you're channeling Maimonides,
Oh,
who said exactly that. He said, how could we be able to state this clearly? We weren't there. Good. So what is at stake theologically in whether God created the world from nothing or whether God created the world from primordial stuff? What difference, if we are imagining God, what difference does that detail make for our understanding of the deity, for our theology? Luther.
If there was a pre-existing soup, then who made that? That's a huge, huge theological and cosmological question.
Good. So if you are a first cause kind of person, as most of us are, right? We can't imagine that you could have stuff without that stuff being created, right? And that becomes very problematic if we are, if we are monotheists. Good. Is God a primordial force or a primordial being? Bob, you want to say more about that?
Well, if there's some kind of substance of the universe, God may be the force that is involved in creation. If God's the primordial being, there's nothing there. God was, and then God created matter and everything that's there. It's a different sequence, but it's also trying to understand what it means that God is all powerful or all knowing or all whatever, which all is critical.
Yeah, Mim.
As long as we're clear, critical to whom. I dare say that for Reconstructionists, it's not critical, period. It's a very interesting intellectual issue, but otherwise totally not critical to our affirmations, to our whatever you call belief, or how we live our lives for that matter.
Good. Certainly for some Reconstructionists. Us being a wide tent and all. So the other thoughts at this point. So what Bob was saying, sometimes in Bibs, if I talk about the omni-God, the God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, right? Which is, one vision of the deity that certain forms of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism share. And this question of, so Bob, by asking, is God a primordial force or a primordial being, you almost solve the problem. But the problem, this notion of whether God creates the world from nothing or not, gets wrapped up in questions, anxieties about God's power. And Mim, I can tell you who it wasn't important to, the folks who wrote the beginning of Genesis. There is, so I'm going to give you a very quick, rip from the pages of Wikipedia tour of this idea of creation from something or creation of nothing. So you know the context in which our medieval commentators are finding themselves. So most ancient Near Eastern mythologies, like Torah, so regardless of how you understand that first sentence, it looks like there's some primordial soup. And most ancient Near Eastern mythologies shared this idea, and no one feels very anxious about it. So that question of if there was stuff, someone must have made it, seems to be a post-ancient Near East question. Right? It doesn't arise in those mythologies or literatures. That was something that it was apparently quite easy for that set of ancients to wrap their head around. It becomes increasingly harder, and it becomes harder after Aristotle, with the idea that, right, everything that is must have a cause. But even kind of in the, and Plato also was a primordial soup kind of guy. In the kind of centuries around the turn of the BCE to CE millennium, it does seem like you're getting a couple of strands of Jewish thought that were toying with this idea of creation from nothing. There's a phrase in Second Maccabees that suggests that in some places, Philo, who was a Greek philosophically inflected Jewish philosopher. Seems like there are a couple of places where he's suggesting it. So it's not an idea that's nowhere. The idea takes off, especially in Christianity, because you get this kind of version of Christian Platonism. I think Plotinus was a Platonist. You have this guy Plotinus who says creation emerges out of the Godhead, right? So that creation is in some way continuous with the divine. Other Christian theologians of that time totally freak out that this idea is too threatening to the kind of an understanding of God being radically other for them to stomach. And you get these stronger and stronger articulations of this creation from nothing idea, which, exactly as Luther and Bob were talking about, is a way of enshrining divine power. That it almost becomes like metonymic or symbolic of this idea that God has absolute power, that God can create from nothing. Islam largely adopts the creation from nothing idea. Again, coming out of a kind of Aristotelian prime mover direction. And Saadia Gaon, 10th century, huge Jewish philosopher of the 10th century, living in Egypt, right? He's the first one to articulate really explicitly in writing in a Jewish text this idea of creation from nothing. So by the time you're at the 10th century, you have the Torah, you have the rabbis who seem pretty relaxed about this whole primordial soup stuff. And then you get Saadia, who's like, no way, no how. And this is part of a larger project that Saadia is doing to kind of reimagine and represent, dare I say, reconstruct a rabbinic theology to be much more the omni-God, to be much more separate from humanity, and have a kind of power and omniscience that is radically other than humans. So not surprising that he goes creation from nothing route. So that's about, a couple hundred years before Rashi and Ibn Ezra. So by the time they come along, you have these two possibilities within Jewish theology, each of which is a plausible reading of the beginning of Genesis, because whoever wrote the beginning of Genesis did not have as good a language arts teacher as most of us did, who would have corrected the grammatical problem. Michael, great question. Do you have an intuition about it?
That's it. I don't have an intuition about it. It's just that we all learn that everything started with the Big Bang, but where did all those molecules and everything come together for the Big Bang? In which case, the other rabbinic side, it was the beginning of a new cycle, that there were, in fact, other bangs before that.
Good. And for a while, the Big Bang was very strongly aligned with a kind of creation ex nihilo thing. And then exactly what you just said begins to happen. And like the first verse of Genesis, it begins to serve both ways.
You keep talking about how the biblical writer didn't use good grammar, but or maybe didn't, but the vowels weren't put in by the biblical writer. And so it's a much easier, what do you call it? It's a much easier solution to say that the people who put the vowels in misread it, and it should have been Bereshit Baro Elohim instead of Bereshit Bara. And that would make it less dependent on whether what the biblical writer, how well he or she was able to express him or herself.
Beautiful. And that's what Rashi is going to say without saying it, because he's not going to question the Masoretic pointing. But he's going to say, so what Mim just did is turned, so instead of saying in the beginning of God created, by changing the vowels, what's now vocalized as God created could be of God's creating, which solves the problem. Things get a little sticky further down the verse, but not too bad. Okay, I'm going to ask that stuff folks are putting in the chat you say out loud, because I can't look at both at once. So Luther, say what you're thinking. Yeah.
Hebrew is an old language, and if you go back to Old English, you'll find the grammatical rules are different from the ones we use now. So the grammar could have been correct for the author.
Great. And I was kind of teasing when I said the grammar was wrong. The grammatical rules are descriptions of what we see in the Hebrew Bible. It wasn't even that they, like, literally those were made up to describe what you see in the Hebrew Bible. So when you have a case like this reshit, which I didn't count them, I don't know, the word appears like a couple dozen times. And in one of those, it's functioning as an absolute noun. One of those, it's definitely functioning as an absolute noun, like the beginning. So this could be 2 out of 24, right? Bob.
You know, the way we talk and the words we use and the concepts we have kind of narrow our way of thinking about things, you know, and I just wrote a comment about this extraordinary stuff from modern astrophysics, that out of empty space, we seem to suddenly have a particle and an antiparticle appear and then disappear. They say light can appear and out of nothing. Well, maybe nothing isn't nothing. Or maybe the nothing is not known or not knowable in some way. And maybe when we're talking about nothing, we're not actually talking about nothing, we're talking about something.
And the range of meanings of tohu vavohu in the Bible are kind of the ancient expression of what is unknowable and unperceived has to have all these different possibilities. Otherwise, it wouldn't be unknowable and unperceived. So there's a way in which the Bereshit bara Elohim problem only becomes a problem after the folks who hold this text as scripture are incorporating certain Greek philosophical patterns of thought that make this stickier than it seems to have been in the ancient world. Anyone who hasn't spoken want to weigh in at this point, or should we keep going? Okay, so Rashi. So we are, so I cheated a little bit because Rashi's commentary on the Torah starts with something else, which actually I won't even go into now, so we can read this. So this actually isn't Rashi's first comment, but it's his first comment specifically on a verse. Will somebody read, and I'm going to stop you all along the way, but actually somebody read through, start reading, I'll tell you when to stop. Neshama, do you want to do it?
Okay, so where do you want me to start? I missed where
In
you
the
want-
beginning, God created, this verse calls aloud.
Okay. In the beginning, God created. This verse calls aloud for explanation in the manner that our rabbis explained it. God created the world for the sake of the Torah, which is called the beginning of his God's way, and for the sake of Israel, who are called the beginning of his God's increase. If, however, you
Okay, so even
restrict-
just stop there.
Okay.
So first thing that Rashi does, this is one of the most delightful things that arises from medieval commentary. There are sticky verses where Rashi will say, the verse cries out. So imagine this verse actually talking to you, dear Shuni, interpret me in a way that goes beyond the pshat. So Rashi is imagining this verse saying, you know, interpret me because there are secrets I have to impart to you that are not in the pshat. And in this case, he says explicitly, Dirshuni, the way the rabbis droshed me. So explicitly interpret me along the lines of these rabbinic midrashic traditions. So what Rashi is doing here is he's looking at two other instances of the word reshit. In one of those instances, at least in the rabbinic imagination, it is referring to Torah. In Proverbs 8, wisdom is speaking, and wisdom describes itself or herself as the beginning of God's way. And then in Jeremiah, you have Reshit being used to describe Israel. So what Rashi is saying is, I don't even need to understand Reshit as beginning. What happens if I play a Mad Libs and understand Reshit according to what it refers to in these two cases? And the other thing he's doing in biblical Hebrew, as in English, although we don't notice it in English, prepositions mean a jillion things. Okay, so by is a good one, right? The book is by Bob, right? That means that Bob is the one who produced the book. I live by a stream, right? There the word means next to. And they're all prepositions, and as I say, we just don't notice it because we understand them contextually. Ba can also mean not only in, but for the sake of, or for the merit of, or through. It means about everything in the universe. So Rashi is saying, really, and he's telling you this is beyond Peshat, right? He's saying that this is already drosh, this is already a little homiletical. But if you understand, so he's saying, really what the first verse of Torah is saying is that for the sake of Torah and for the sake of Israel, God created the heavens and the earth. So what do you make of that? What question is he answering that's really, really different from the plain sense questions raised by the verse? And where's Mim? Mim, when you said, Reconstructionists don't care, in some ways he is changing the conversation in ways that actually may even be somewhat contemporary.
He's changing it from how to why. Why did God create the world?
Right, which in some ways is a much more interesting question. And what's his answer?
For the sake of the Jewish people, for his people, for his flock, his flock.
And what do you make of that change?
Well, he's getting away from the grammatical problem and creating another rationale for why the Jewish people were the chosen people.
What do you think of somebody inserting that idea of Israel centeredness and Torah centeredness at the very beginning of the story of creation. Do you like it? Don't you like it? Why might Rashi sitting there in 12th century France feel the impulse to do that?
Well, I mean, in a world where crusades were going on and, Jews were thought of as being the enemy of God, basically he's turning it on its head and said, no, God, this is the purpose of God, or God's purpose.
Other thoughts?
It makes me think that the creation wasn't just a random set of actions, that it was actually a present. It was a gift.
Other?
I'm just going to throw this out. I don't know if it relates or not, but my understanding in the Kabbalistic, in the Hasidic world, God really wants people. So like God is really creating this for God's sake, that there's a need involved.
Nice. That there, and even in the rabbinic tradition, right? God has a need for Israel. So yes, on the one hand, it's a gift, but if you extend that story longer, it is necessary in what at least the rabbis and the Kabbalists are going to imagine is in some way God's primary relationship. Other things that strike you about this kind of crazy move? I'm not fishing. I'm just seeing if there's anything else you want on the table. So the one other thing I'll throw out is that Rashi, and he's not the only one, is a little nervous by how long it takes Torah to get to Avraham, right? That we spent the first two parshiot, if you're thinking in kind of lectionary time, before we get a hint or a whisper of an Israelite. And this this retrojection of chosenness into the very beginning is one example of things you see elsewhere. So Haftarah for Breshit comes from Isaiah 52, I want to say, and it says, I who created the heavens and the earth took you by the hand, Israel, and, did whatever. I forget what the rest of it is. So the Haftarah also is like, we're not going to let this week go by without making really clear that God had Israel in mind from the get-go. So that's part of the move that Rashi is doing here. But even if we are not, if the particularistness of it, if the chosenness gives you hives a little bit, I think the opening of like, well, maybe that's a more interesting question. I think is one of the things that even if we are not embracers of chosenness, that Rashi's comment can do here. So that's his drash. That's his kind of homiletical move. Neshama, keep going, if however.
Okay. If, however, you wish to explain it in its plain sense, explain it thus. At the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, when the earth was without form and void, and there was darkness, God said, "Let there be light." The text does not intend to point out the order of the acts of creation, to state that these, heaven and earth, were created first. For if it intended to point this out, it should be written, "At first God created," etc.
Good.
And
so he's actually going to give you a whole other word. He's going to say that if what it meant was at the beginning, it would have said berishona, right? Which is a more kind of customary word for at first or at the beginning. So Neshama, just so we make sure we all understand it, how is he saying you should translate it?
At
The
first,
ex nihilo way or the not ex nihilo way?
the the way that Shana, let me think, Shana. I think that he's creating it first. So actually that there is primordial stuff. And then he's doing this with the primordial stuff.
Good. So Rashi is coming out very strongly on the side of the primordial soup people. And he's saying, if Torah wanted you to think it was creation from nothing, it would have said that explicitly. We would not have had this muddiness. And then he explains, keep going, and for this reason.
And for this reason, because wherever the word
Reshit
occurs in scripture, it is in the construct state. In other words, or for example, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, the beginning of his kingdom, the first fruit of thy corn. Similarly, here you must translate Bereshit bara Elohim as though it read Bereshit biro
Good.
at the I lost that. Okay. At the beginning of God's creating.
Beautiful. So what's he doing here? How methodologically is he making his case that that Reshit is in the construct, right? That it connects to what comes after it. What's his method? Yeah, ma'am.
Would you call that an inductive method based on the evidence, inductive and grammatical from other parts of the Tanakh?
So he's going
He's
to
collecting
other
examples. He's collecting
Good.
examples, yeah.
Good. So he's collecting examples from other parts of Tanakh. And he says in all these other places, they're in the construct form, they're in the X of Y form. Therefore, that must be what it is here. What assumptions is he making about language and about the language of Tanakh and about ancient Hebrew that support, what would you have to believe to be convinced by his argument?
That was all written at the same time.
Okay, good. That it's all
The
somehow
same
like
author.
the same level of language.
It was the same author, because it's all being used the same way, and it was all intended, the intent was there from the very beginning.
And you have to believe the author was consistent.
Yeah, it's the same author.
And you have to believe that the intent of the same author, was consistent, because it could be
Good.
that the intent differed,
And the author did not evolve,
did not evolve or intended
not learn.
different meanings. Exactly.
Good.
Right.
So what you're hearing here, and when Luther said, like, maybe back then it was good grammar, right? And I said, Luther, we'd come back to it. So one of the assumptions that arises already at the level of rabbinic reading in Midrash and carries through the medieval period, and in some ways forms the basis of contemporary biblical study, is the idea that there is at least largely consistency among the Hebrew of the Bible. And as you get further and further into modernity, and especially once you get into kind of the 19th, 20th century, where, the idea of a unified authorship breaks apart, you're getting a more nuanced sense of that. So like if you were to look up the word kadosh, right, holy, in a biblical dictionary, it would tell you that in priestly sources, it tends to mean this. In Deuteronomic sources, it can mean this. So that idea of unity is getting busted up. But the idea that that you can learn what a word means in one place by looking at it in other places remains very much a fundament of all kinds of biblical research and criticism. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Like what does it make possible? And what do those assumptions kind of close off? Mip.
So we're all, those of us who've been studying recently, Bob Alter is the big authority now. And he really seems to have bought in, is that what he bought? Yeah. He seems to have bought into, of course, not the one author, but the one redactor. So that things that, even if it wasn't the same author, some degree of uniformity of grammar and interpretation, at least through the Torah, stays pretty consistent, because he thinks there was probably not a lot, maybe only one, maybe not a lot more than one redactor. And his translation reflects that. And that's the newest hot thing going, is studying from studying from Alter.
Luther, what are you gonna?
So Mim kind of answered my question, but I guess I'm wondering, among the medieval scholars and earlier, was there not an underlying assumption that it's not a unified redactor or a unified author, but a unified inspiration, that all of this was divinely inspired and therefore it has to be consistent across centuries?
It's a great question. When the rabbis and the medievals are theorizing the language of Tanakh, and this starts back in the rabbinic period, there are two, the school of Rabbi Akiba and the school of Rabbi Ishmael. The school of Rabbi Ishmael understands divine language, which means, Torah and Tanakh language, to be constitutively different from human language. So that's where one of the things Ibn Ezra says, we talked about this 2 times ago. He says, I don't think variations in spelling are relevant for meaning. The school of Rabbi Ishmael sure did. So whereas if I were reading, a text that in some places the word color was spelled C-O-L-O-R and in some places it was spelled C-O-L-O-U-R, the most meaning making I would make out of that was, maybe there's a British American thing going on here, but I wouldn't think the word meant something different. Ibn Ezra says when you're reading divine language, that actually changes there is some value added, some semantic difference. So I think that is, they're not going to argue so much one author more than one author, but they are going to say that it is kind of qualitatively a different kind of language that invites a different kind of reading. Akiba's going to say, no, more like the language of humans. You can't play that many games, but you can play some games. Debbie.
Well, now I'm going to ask a different question than I originally was going to ask. So, I mean, to me, well, I guess there's 2 points I wanted to make. They're kind of minor, but one is, when as commentary progresses and we start looking at alternatives, it doesn't mean that we have to invalidate the merit of former methods. So it does, perhaps then looking at other examples in Torah text or Tanakh is not the sole answer or the sole way that we interpret what it means, but it certainly is a form of evidence, and it certainly can be clarifying. So I guess that's one thing I would say. And as far as spelling or alterations, certainly if we see a word repeated, we don't say, oh, that's a mistake or a typo, or that has no meaning because it doesn't change the meaning. Sure, it has meaning, right? Because there's a reason for emphasis. So placement, Spelling, I'll agree. That's a little. I'm not so sure that is significant always. Might be interesting to note, but certainly the ways, the placement of words, the way they're repeated, the emphasis, the focal point, that all does matter in terms of extracting appropriate meaning from the text. In my view.
Good. So there are going to be all sorts of literary features that a reader chooses whether or not to read as semantically significant or not. Ralph.
Yeah, I was going to add, doesn't the Torah even make a point of whenever there is that misspelling, that was actually a purposeful reason? They try to actually make a whole drash about that?
Yeah, so the rabbis, starting in the Midrash, you're going to get these elaborate drashot around variant spellings. And in fact, one of the things that the Masoretic commentators, editors, if you look at the Masorah, which are the Masoretic notes on the Torah and biblical text, they count the number of times the word gets a variant spelling. So partly that's because they're really, really interested in preserving the that each subsequent copy of a text is identical. So since the likelihood is that a scribe is going to unconsciously correct a variant spelling, they're like, no, keep this weird spelling. Because they're really invested in uniformity of subsequent versions back to what they think is the authoritative version. But that also then preserves the possibility, Ralph, of what you're talking about, that those kind of variants get stay there as fodder for interpretation.
Yeah, and it also adds that it's kind of a transcendent text, that it's not just, the scribes, kind of making room that the scribes could make errors, but in fact, it's so transcendent that that they still take it literally.
Beautiful. And there are, have you guys ever worked with the Biblia Hebraica? Maybe we'll do that one day. So the version of the Bible that you get in like the JPS Tanakh is the Aleppo Codex. It is a reproduction of the manuscript, the kind of best, oldest, complete manuscript of the Bible. And that's what we get. And occasionally, like, when you're reading in your JPS Bible, occasionally they'll say meaning of Hebrew unknown or meaning of Hebrew uncertain, but that's all it tells you. In a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible, and the most commonly used is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, what it gives you at the bottom, there are all these notes about variants. So if there are other manuscripts that have a different vocalization, or if all the ancient translations seem to be reading a different text, you have all those notes at the bottom. And now that our students, it's so easy to get, just to go to Safaria, I have to browbeat them. I'm like, look at BHS. I know when you're looking at it and I know when you're not. And Ralph, what that does is in some way, it desacralizes those variants. Because if there's something, so for instance, the Septuagint, instead of having Bereshit, it essentially has Berishonah, right? The Greek translation is translating it, is simplifying it. And then the Vulgate does it, and everybody who's looking at the Septuagint does it. But there are other places where all the ancient witnesses seem to have had a different Hebrew text, where what we have in the Masoretic text may have been a mistake. But it gets sacralized and then gets read, and Ralph, exactly as you're saying, gets made transcendent. And when we get to Ibn Ezra, we'll see to what extent you think he's enacting that kind of sacralized view of language or not. It's 102. So I just want to end by saying that we ended, Rashi ends where Mim was earlier. He says, I'm not actually going to rewrite the Torah or revocalize it, but the way I'm going to solve that grammatical problem is that you should read bara as if it said baro, right? So it's a kind of quasi correction that allows him to read Bereshit as in the beginning of, and allows him to use it to articulate this sense of primordial soup. The one other thing I'll say is, I was reading something today. I forget who it was. It was on the Torah.com, because I always look to see what all those folks are saying. And it was really interesting because the way, I think it was Menachem Kellner, the way he understood what Rashi was doing here was that first reading, the interpret me reading about God created the world for the sake of Israel and for the sake of Torah, is the one that he wants people to walk away with. And where he says, if, however, you wish to explain it in its plain sense, it's like, and you like stubborn 5%ers who really want to know the pshat, I'll throw you a bone. But that in Rashi's world, when we talked about what pshat means, and whether it's plain sense authoritative, whether it's authoritative Jewish, Kellner is reading this, that the rhetorical move is to say, the real meaning for that he wants you to walk away with is the for the sake of Torah and for the sake of Israel. And for you nudniks who are for some reason insisting on a literal interpretation, and you're trying to decide between in the beginning God created or in the beginning of God's creation, go with the latter. So next month, Ibn Ezra.
Thank you so much. That was just unbelievable.
Always
Thank you,
a
Elsie.
joy to
That's
study
great.
with you all.
That was wonderful.
Hi,
Thank you.
Gertie.
Who? Oh.
I'm saying hi to Gertie because I hang out with her daughter and grandkids and granddog all the time.
Okay,
See you all next month.
Yes,
Bye.
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next month.
Bye.
This week. Okay. Bye, all. Thank you. Again.
A different week of the month, right?
Yes.
We're going back to the first week.
How are
I
you?
almost missed
It
this
was
one
great.
because of
It
that.
was
Yeah.
amazing, amazing. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye now.